John Wayne Gacy, a sadistic serial killer that fooled even his closest friends and neighbors.
This is a hard-driving, very hard-working individual. I was astounded.
A pillar of society with a shocking secret.
We took a screwdriver into a little crack in the floor, and when we did, the whole floor lifted up.
He would become one of the most prolific serial killers in American history.
They asked him, well, why did you do this stuff? I was afraid they would expose me. He said, they were all just human trash anyway.
But was John Wayne Gacy a product of his upbringing, or was he born to kill? John Wayne Gacy was born in Chicago in 1942, the only son of Marion and John Gacy Sr.
John Gacy was a son of a blue-collar worker, a mother who was a pharmacist. His biological father drank alcohol, but continued to work. He was considered a functioning alcoholic.
From what I understand, he was physically abused by his father, and his father was often not available or was intoxicated. His father was also known for abusing Gacy's mother. In fact, engaging in physical fights with her that Gacy must have witnessed. Now, clearly those sorts of things have an impact on a person's development and the way they look at the world.
The young John was close to his mother, but to his father, the overweight, unathletic boy was a disappointment, one that he made little effort to hide.
His father would come home, he would go down into the basement, into his workshop, not interact with anyone in the family, but had this special thing about his son, whom he felt should be better, more like the father, become a business person, become someone who was admired in the community.
Gacy's father regularly called him stupid, a mama's boy, and a sissy.
His father frequently told him that he was a failure, he wouldn't amount to anything. So again, you think of how someone growing up with that kind of verbal abuse and emotional abuse would develop as an adult.
John entered his teenage years and began to complain of body problems, headaches, faintness, dizziness, which the father must have seen as a weakening, that this was not a strong person, this was not a person who could stand up and be tall and be successful.
At school, the young Gacy continued to disappoint.
He entered serially high schools, and to great disappointment to his father, he tended to fail. And there were reasons for failure perhaps put forward. I mean, he was ADHD, he had real problems concentrating.
Despite his failures, John Gacy Jr. was getting a reputation as a braggart. He told fanciful stories and could confidently talk himself out of trouble. At 11 years old, Gacy was struck on the head by a swing, resulting in a series of blackouts. His father accused him of faking. At age 16, he began taking medication for a heart ailment. Gacy was seen as weaker than other teenagers.
These conspired, but overriding most of these excuses for his failure was the basic fact that John Wayne Gacy was very good at producing justifications and excuses for why he failed.
Aged 20 and without qualifications, Gacy left Chicago and struck out on his own. He traveled to Las Vegas, where he found a job cleaning up in a mortuary.
He entered the world on a one-to-one basis. He no longer, as it were, were living in the shadow of his family, and particularly his father. He kind of felt a bit of a release. Working in there and sweeping up was probably not the kind of high-status job, but it was a job he attained on his own, and it was a job that he managed to hold down.
The work was low-paid and menial. Gacy often worked alone, with only dead bodies for company.
A number of serial killers will go through a variety of experiences which will mean that they come into close proximity with dead bodies. In Gacy's case, we know that he acted as a janitor in a mortuary. We have a kind of familiarization with dead bodies, a familiarization that would take away the taboo of being around a dead body.
John Wayne Gacy's new life in Las Vegas didn't last long. After only 3 months, he used what little money he'd saved to return to Chicago. There he enrolled in a business college, and for the first time Gacy began to flourish. He'd always had the gift of the gab, and he soon discovered a flair for salesmanship.
Gacy suddenly realized that there was something that gave him esteem. It's something that made him stand up in the world, where he could, as it were, stand shoulder to shoulder, and even beyond that, with those individuals around him.
By the age of just 21, Gacy's business talents had won him the position of manager at a shoe store.
He realized that his abilities, his acting abilities, his charm and disarm abilities that most kind of inherent psychopaths seem to have, this cold indifference, actually works for you in interactions. He then found this success, and he found his career success could even match the expectations of his father.
In September 1964, Gacy met and married his co-worker Marlin Myers. Marlin's father saw promise in his ambitious new son-in-law and appointed him the manager of his 3 fast food franchises in Iowa. John and Marlin began a new life in Waterloo. Together they had 2 children. Gacy was now a family man, a rising star in the local business world, and a popular member of the community. On the surface, it was a storybook existence.
Gacy was a role model. He was a role model of what a businessman should be. He should be involved in all of these political organizations, all of these business organizations. He should be the upstanding citizen in his small town. But it really had no meaning for him. Otherwise, if it had, he wouldn't have needed to go into the remainder of what he did for the rest of his life.
What John Wayne Gacy would become would shock his suburban neighbors to their core. After a childhood plagued by illness and failure, John Wayne Gacy now had a wife, 2 children, and was the successful manager of a chain of fast food outlets. The Gacys appeared the perfect nuclear family. But behind the respectable facade, John Wayne Gacy had begun to inhabit a world at odds with the straight-laced image of Midwestern suburbia.
He got started abusing teenage boys sexually, and there are a few chilling incidents where he actually threatened some of these young men, though he didn't injure or kill anyone as far as we know.
In 1967, Gacy lured 16-year-old John Tullery to his home. They watched pornographic movies, drank, and played pool. Then, without warning, Gacy forced Tullery onto a bed at knife point, handcuffed him, and started to choke him.
In the case of John Tullery, he followed the usual getting them drunk and showing pornography and then turning suddenly and using violence or threat, and in this case a knife, to force that person into handcuffs, into a power submissive role, and then to actually inflict torturous sexual behavior, taunting, choking, threats to that individual, who would, generally speaking, in many occasions, not report this.
But Tullery did report his ordeal, and other boys would follow. Gacy was arrested. The 26-year-old family man and bright light of the community was charged with sodomy and sentenced to 10 years in Anamosa.
It's a high-walled institution. There are armed guards on the towers and very restricted movement inside the compound of the prison.
Fellow inmate Ray Cornell became Gacy's close friend.
It was rigorous, as prison, I think, should be. It was dangerous. There were numerous murder attempts while I was serving the 2 years that I was there. On at least one occasion, I witnessed a person stabbed to death. It was not a very nice place to be.
A convicted homosexual sex offender, Gacy should have been high on the prison hit list.
John told everyone that he was serving time for showing pornographic movies to teenage boys. John was very careful never to reveal the fact that he in fact was in there for molesting or attempting to molest teenage boys.
With the truth behind his crimes successfully hidden, Gacy showed the same ambitious streak as he had as a free man, only this time he was striving to be a pillar of a very different community. Richard Snavely was a prison counsellor at the time he came into contact with inmate Gacy.
He had a small little sign that he wore that was very much like the name tags that the employees wore, which said John Gacy, first cook.
And you're a man of some authority here. What is your title?
Well, I'm first cook in the kitchen, and I run the morning meal and the afternoon meal in the kitchen.
John, how long you been here?
I've been here now a year and about 2 weeks.
He kind of got himself ingratiated into the system. He was very responsible, very adult in his style. He was older than the average inmate. He was able to try to develop a position, and he was pretty successful in doing that.
But his friend Ray Cornell witnessed another side to John Wayne Gacy during an encounter with an openly gay convict known as Mr. Connect.
Mr. Connect and some of his friends were in the lower yard of the prison playing basketball, and the ball got loose and went rolling past John. And John got the ball and threw it as hard as he could. And Connect, not showing a lot of good judgment, then said, missed me, now you gotta kiss me. And John went after it. Just for a second, I think I saw just a glimpse of what his victims saw at the end of their lives, because he had every intention of going after Gary Connect and hurting him badly or killing him. I think I saw the monster.
At Christmas 1969, Gacy received news that would affect him profoundly.
We were sitting in the lower yard in the card playing area when a guard came down and got John and took him up to the security office.
Gacy's father had died from cirrhosis, and the authorities were not to permit him to attend the funeral.
When I saw him again the following morning in the chow hall, he was a wreck.
He requested permission to visit his father and I suppose make amends with him. My suspicion is that when his father died, that was difficult, because what it means is that you can never repair this relationship. People always want the approval of their parents, no matter how old they are.
He talked about his father over the next several days, and he also talked about how deeply hurt he was at the fact that he would not be going over to Chicago to see his father buried.
But in 1970, less than 2 years after his conviction, Gacy's model behavior paid off.
You mind my asking how long do you plan to take up residence here?
Well, I hope to be getting out sometime in May.
Well, good.
What's interesting about Gacy's prison experiences as a result of the sodomy charges is, firstly, he's released very quickly. His sentence was 10 years. He was out after 18 months. He was able to convince people that his behavior wouldn't be repeated. But within that 18 months, he rises to the top of the prison hierarchy, despite the fact, as a sex offender, one would have expected him to be at the bottom of the prison hierarchy. So what we're seeing here is the skills that actually underlie Gacy's behavior over a long period of time, skills that allow other people to gain confidence in him, to see him as responsible, to see him as trustworthy. Of course, ultimately, he would abuse that responsibility, he'd abuse that trust.
In 1970, Gacy, now divorced, returned to his home city of Chicago, eventually settling into the quiet suburban neighborhood of Norwood. Leaving his past in Iowa, Gacy continued his ambitions to be seen as an important, valued pillar of the local community. He married divorcee Carol Hoff, and she and her 2 children moved into his home.
There was an indomitable spirit in Gacy. He really did think he was beginning to become invulnerable, that he could rise again. And simply getting married was just another strategic plan as far as Gacy was concerned. There was no real sexual intent in this marriage. It was convenience.
As in Iowa, Gacy's image as the perfect suburban neighbor was a mere facade. In 1971, he was charged by Chicago police with disorderly conduct after a teenage boy complained that Gacy had picked him up at a bus station and forced him to commit a sexual act. The case was dropped when the boy failed to appear in court. In 1972, Gacy was charged with battery when a young man complained he had been forced to perform oral sex after Gacy had told him he was a sheriff's deputy. The case never went to trial. Timothy Jack McCoy was just 15 years old when he was picked up by Gacy at a Chicago bus station in 1972. After spending the night together, Gacy stabbed him to death. Gacy would later claim the killing was accidental and in self-defense.
Many murderers commit a murder because of the force of particular circumstances at a particular point in their life. But crucially, the vast majority of murderers are overwhelmed psychologically by the fact they've taken another person's life. And they never want to repeat that experience because they understand how difficult that has been, not just for the victim's family, but also for themselves. Sadly, a small number of murderers want to continue to behave like that because they found that experience visceral, vital, exciting, sexy.
Gacy had his first taste of murder. It would be far from his last. In 1970, after serving time in prison for molesting teenage boys, John Wayne Gacy remarried and began building a new life in Chicago. But his image as a loving family man and generous neighbor was a sham. In 1972, he'd picked up 15-year-old Timothy McCoy for sex and killed him. Gacy would not be arrested for the murder of the teenager. As far as the rest of the world was concerned, the 15-year-old had simply disappeared. And to the local community, John Wayne Gacy seemed ever more the perfect suburban neighbor.
The neighbors on the block liked him. He was a very friendly man.
He would give these tremendous outside parties for 100 to 200 people.
Gacy regularly entertained his neighbors by dressing up as a clown and performing magic tricks.
Gacy was the kind of person that, not knowing how evil he was, you would like to have him in your community. He was active in the JCs, which is the Junior Chamber of Commerce, and he was a volunteer for the political party of his choice, and he was very well thought of in the very small world of his community.
In 1974, Gacy established his own painting, decorating and construction business, hiring a string of young men to carry out the work. His charisma and bravado ensured there was no shortage of potential employees.
The boys knew John Wayne Gacy. He was a big name in town. And when he walked in, he was John. He had the big car outside. He had the money. Everybody knew he was wealthy. He had a big business. And when he approached boys that were 14, 15, 16 years old, making minimum wage, and he was promising them almost double salary just to work in a construction site and help him build. These boys jumped at the chance.
Gacy's upstanding image as generous neighbor, successful businessman, and do-gooder in the community meant his motives for employing many of the young men went undiscovered.
I find it very interesting that people have a Hollywood image of the serial killer as being this rather scary man that's going to pop up from behind a bush and attack and kill, whereas in fact serial killers by and large are very well socialized into their community, often holding down very responsible jobs within the community, often seen as being pillars of the community. And indeed, Gacy is almost living out a fantasy that he must have had about being a pillar of the community. So here's somebody living out the fantasy of normality. Albeit all the time, we know he's also a closet homosexual who's engaging in sodomy with young men that he's able to convince to engage in sexual activity with him, perhaps through the status that he had buying those sexual services.
By the mid-70s, behind closed doors, Gacy's wife began complaining of his violent mood swings. He'd lost interest in marital sex and was keeping homosexual pornography around the house. She divorced him and moved out. Gacy began actively cruising Chicago's city streets, looking to pick up young men from gay districts, known pickup spots, and areas where waifs and strays would congregate.
Gacy was able to actually use one of his roles, that of a pseudo-police officer. He had the wherewithal in terms of, a radio, and he would often hide behind a badge and have, bits of what looked like police paraphernalia.
He would pick them up here, cruising the streets in a car that had a very large light on it, as the police often did, and he would be able to stop people using that as if he were a police officer, picking up strays, taking them home, torturing them.
In 1975, boys began disappearing. Some had been selling sex on the streets. Some were young runaways. Some were connected with his construction business.
Gacy's technique of charming and disarming his victims was pretty much similar to the way that he actually engaged people in a legitimate business way. He would keep them entertained with his verbal rapport and be able to actually charm them quickly and rapidly into situations that they could not escape from. And once he had got them into a position where he felt that he was totally in power, he would change. He would change very quickly. In the twinkling of an eye, he would become the commanding, frightening, torturous monster.
The young men would frequently be drugged, handcuffed, subjected to repeated rapes and terrifying ordeals of torture. Then they would be strangled.
He always picked the kind of attractive guy that he could never be himself. But these individuals became less individualistic as far as he's concerned. They became more and more objects. I mean, the more they became simply objects for him to do with as he wished, the more horrific and torturous their experience was within his company.
Gacy seems to me to fall into the criteria of the hedonistic serial killer. In other words, the person who kills simply for the sexual thrill of killing, in particular strangling his young victims and sodomizing them.
Rumours circulated amongst the gay community about the dangers of a large man with a liking for violent, sadistic sex. But despite an ever-increasing number of disappearing young men, they were simply assumed to have left town or run away. With no bodies discovered, they were chalked up as just another of the thousands of missing persons reported in the city each year.
The police tend to call young kids of that kind blue dross. They tend to call them that as a way of saying they don't matter as much as kids from a normal background, so we don't give them as much attention. We also know, because of their sexuality, that often that means the police don't take enough notice of the violence in gay men's lives.
Even when police were alerted to Gacy's sadistic behavior, they failed to act. On a night in March 1978, 27-year-old Jeffrey Rignall was lured into Gacy's car by his offer to share a joint. He was chloroformed, driven to Gacy's house, and subjected to prolonged, agonizing sexual torture. After being repeatedly drugged, he eventually awoke, sprawled under a statue in Chicago's Lincoln Park. Despite reporting the incident, Gacy remained at large.
Gacy's protection from investigation and prosecution was this established good citizen that he'd managed to fabricate in the community, where he felt to some degree he was pretty much invulnerable from accusations from young lads who were probably not thought of very well in the community. He also knew that it was pretty difficult for someone to make accusations of homosexual nature and of someone who would suddenly want to torture someone. This was out of context, particularly out of context given his standing.
But John Wayne Gacy was about to make a fatal mistake.
When Gacy stopped targeting young gay homeless men who weren't really part of the community, but instead targeted Robert Piest, who was an all-American high school kid with a good family, who were going to report him as missing, who were going to say, how's the police investigation going? It was only by choosing that type of victim that really was the unraveling of Gacy.
15-year-old Robert Piest was considered the archetypal clean-cut all-American boy, popular with his peers and loved by his close family. On December the 11th, 1978, he was working his regular job in a pharmacy, saving money towards college. He was looking forward to joining his mother's birthday celebrations that evening. When she came to collect him at 9 p.m., he asked her to wait for a moment while he went to talk to a man who was in the parking lot about an offer of a construction job. He did not return. Chief of Detectives Joseph Kozenzak received the missing persons report.
This is where Robert Piest worked. The boy's mother came here to pick him up, and when she arrived, the boy told her that he wanted her to wait inside so he could go outside to talk to someone about summer work. And once the boy went out the front door, he was never seen again. The owners of the drugstore told us that they had a contractor who was to do repair work inside of their pharmacy. They supplied us with some information pertaining to his telephone number, and through the phone number we were able to determine his full name and address. And that's the first time we ever knew the name John Wayne Gacy.
Detectives headed to the businessman's home to question him, hoping they would find the missing 15-year-old safe and unharmed.
Gacy had a diamond-shaped window in his front door. And the front part of his house was dark, but there was a street lamp on the sidewalk in front of his residence. And I stood in front of his door knocking on it. With the reflection of the light into the window, I could see a face staring back at us. Then the face faded into the darkness of the house. And as we walked along the side of the house and looked inside of a window, we could see Gacy sitting in a chair watching television, drinking a beer. It was an uncomfortable feeling being inside his residence. And he was belligerent, uncooperative, and seemed nervous.
Suspecting Gacy knew more than he was revealing, detectives obtained a search warrant and discovered a concealed void beneath the house.
The crawl space was actually hidden by a secret trap door in a closet. And one of my investigators found that and pointed that out to me. We took a screwdriver into a little crack in the floor and pried it up. And when we did, the whole floor lifted up. And that led us into the crawl space. And I went down there with a flashlight and looked around, and everything was dry and solid. There was no evidence.
Teenager Robert Piest was nowhere to be found. Detectives placed Gacy under 24-hour surveillance.
When we started our surveillance, Gacy initially responded by telling many of his friends that we were FBI agents, that we were bodyguards. But ultimately what happened is he really started to break down psychologically, in the sense that he couldn't maintain his day-to-day facade of being Mr. Nice Guy or a businessman, because every time he went out his front door, there was a police car sitting there waiting to follow him around.
Despite finding no bodies at his house, the police had discovered a stash of personal possessions that appeared to have been collected as trophies.
We had started to find case reports based on pieces of ID we found on the first search warrant, and identified those little pieces of identification as being missing persons who were former employees of Gacy's.
The mounting evidence convinced detectives that they should begin digging in the crawl space under Gacy's house. Prosecuting attorney Robert Egan was one of the first on the scene.
The first body was excavated, and everyone was kind of standing around waiting for the excavation. There was a lot of water in the crawl space. As a matter of fact, the body had to be taken up literally out of water. The evidence technician had to reach down and feel a rib cage and then pull the rib cage up out of the water. The parts were put into a body bag, and as that was taking place, the evidence technician that was doing the excavation was feeling down under the water, and he yelled out to us, and everybody kind of turned around to see what he was worried. He said, I've got another rib cage down here.
Beneath the unassuming suburban home, detectives had made a discovery that would see it become one of the most infamous houses in American history. In 1978, the search for 15-year-old Robert Piest had led detectives to the home of John Wayne Gacy, a businessman and pillar of the local community. There they discovered the remains of a decomposing body in a hidden crawl space beneath the house. But that was only the beginning.
The evidence technician that was doing the excavation, he yelled out to us. He said, I've got another rib cage down here.
The second set of remains was merely the tip of the iceberg. Body after decomposing body was being unearthed.
Gacy kept the bodies of his victims under the house. It's an ideal way to remember where his victims were. It's an ideal way of keeping control over those victims even after they've died.
A total of 29 young men were discovered buried on Gacy's property, 27 of them in the crawl space beneath his home. In police custody, Gacy began to confess. He admitted to strangling all but his first victim. He would choke them with a tourniquet as they were sexually assaulted. He referred to this as his rope trick. He claimed some victims convulsed for an hour or two before dying.
When the investigation started, the neighbors essentially were just shocked beyond belief, because most of the neighbors, even at that point in time, still said, John would never do anything to harm anybody. My son played by his house. He's always had parties for the neighborhood. He was a nice guy, a good businessman. So the neighbors were just totally shocked.
I was astounded. This is a hard-driving, very hard-working individual. This is a guy who appeared to have the social norms and the social values of the average middle American right down to the ground. I certainly did not anticipate anything like that. When I found out, I was stunned.
But none of the bodies under the house was 15-year-old Robert Piest. His whereabouts were finally discovered in April 1979. Robert had been killed on the night of his abduction. With no space left under his house, Gacy had thrown the teenager's body from a bridge into the Des Plaines River. 3 other boys had suffered the same fate. On February the 6th, 1980, 37-year-old John Wayne Gacy stood trial for the murder of 33 young men.
Well, the defense argued that he was insane because he couldn't control his actions. I mean, obviously he couldn't control his actions. He killed 33 people that we know of. But as an insanity defense in a legal courtroom, that's not going to hold up.
Prosecutor William Kunkel was convinced he could prove Gacy had been sane and fully aware of his wrongdoing.
He had underlined passages and read in his family Bible indicating his knowledge of his own guilt as a Catholic. The blasphemers, the idolaters, the abusers of themselves with mankind shall not inherit the kingdom of God. He had that underlined. He had the Illinois statute book with the paper clips and underlining on the Sexually Dangerous Persons Act. He knew exactly what he was doing, and he even knew what the consequences of it was. So he never showed any remorse, never any contrition, no emotion. It's what psychiatrists call a flat affect. Very narcissistic. Well, he was all that mattered.
On March the 13th, 1980, John Wayne Gacy was found guilty and sentenced to serve 12 death sentences and 21 natural life sentences.
They asked him, well, why did you do this stuff? And he said, well, there were several reasons. With some of the kids, I was afraid they would expose me. Others threatened to expose me, so I had to kill them. He said, and they were all just human trash anyway. That was his reason.
On May the 10th, 1994, after 14 years on death row, John Wayne Gacy was executed by lethal injection. Gacy remains one of America's most prolific serial murderers. But what drove him to snuff out the lives of 33 young men? Was the belittling and abuse at the hands of his alcoholic father the catalyst? Was the blood clot on his brain from his childhood accident with a swing the trigger? Or was John Wayne Gacy simply born to kill?
I don't think there's anything in Gacy's background that suggests that he was born to kill. My sympathy for Gacy's circumstances is that homophobia is a very difficult cultural phenomenon to overcome. And as a gay man, Gacy must have felt it was very difficult to be open about his sexuality. And whilst we must never accept responsibility for the deaths that Gacy caused, what we should do is analyze cultures that regards one gender as superior to another and one sexuality as superior to another.
He clearly lacked a conscience, had no feeling towards others, that he was very callous and cold and calculating. I can only conclude that people are born with this deficit, and there's no way we can change that. We can't teach someone to develop a conscience if it's not there. So just imagine yourself if you lacked a conscience, the sorts of things that you could get away with without feeling bad. It's a conscience that makes most of us behave because we'd feel bad. If you were suddenly freed of that, think of what you might do.
Forensic psychologist Dr. Helen Morrison spent 600 hours in the company of the serial killer. And after his death, was given permission by Gacy's family to have his brain examined. There were no obvious abnormalities.
To him, those men and those boys were vermin. They just needed to be extinguished for no reason other than the fact that they needed to be gotten rid of. 99% of serial murderers are male. And this is around the world. It covers all cultures. It covers all socioeconomic groups. It covers all religious groups. It covers any type of place that you can imagine in the world. And yet they are so like, they've been cut out with a cookie cutter. They are so exactly the same. So we have to assume that there is some genetic foundation. It has to be a mutation.